So there are sliding doors moments, and there are sliding doors moments, or are there any at all? Who knows? Krishnamurti said everything is meant to be and will happen, which is different to everything happens for a reason. Which
the Irish mystic.
Krishnamurti.
Krishnamurti.
Murphy, of course. Yeah. But does everything happen for a reason or not? Are there such things as sliding door moments, or the point is we're going towards Live Aid. So what happens is Bob and the Boomtown Rats have a singer act called Dave. It's not doing as well as they want it to.
Yeah.
So Bob goes to the record company offices and has a word with them, get us on top of the pops. That's not going to happen. So he ends up arriving home early one afternoon.
Yeah. We had a few grand left to Prue's point in the bank, and getting desperate because we really thought we'd made a good track here, but the truth is our time had been and gone, and I was not prepared to face that. So I gave Gary, who lives in the Midlands, and Simon, who lives in the West Country, a couple of grand or a grand each. They have big motorbikes, huge motorbikes. I said, go and buy as many copies of Dave in the Midlands and the West Country as you possibly can from, in those days, chart return shops. If you sold records in those shops, you go into the charts. My thinking was, if we can buy enough tracks to get into the top 40, we'll get top of the pops. If we get top of the pops, it was so powerful back in those days, you'd have a hit. And then once people hear and see us again, we're back. We obviously didn't have enough money to buy enough records of Dave. So I come home, to your point, I'm home by 6. Now, if you're in rock and roll, that's a measure of where we were at. You're really not home at 6. You're rehearsing, you're writing, you're recording, you're doing interviews, you're doing gigs, you're travelling. You're really not at home at 6. I was home. I just had my first baby, little girl, and my missus had put her to bed, and we sat down and watched the 6 o'clock news. In those days, there was ITV and BBC only, so what I hadn't sort of counted on was that the whole country is watching the 6 o'clock news. Anyway, it comes on top of the story is a 10-minute report on a famine in Ethiopia, in Africa, which the brilliant journalist Michael Burke had stumbled upon as he was on his way north to cover the longest running war of the 20th century, which was the Ethiopian Civil War. And it was simultaneously shameful, disgusting, horrific, and anger-inducing. Here, the journalist had made the report with such elegance, with such a sense of shared humanity. At first, the camera is very wide, and the journalist barely speaks, he's so enraged. But out went, journalistic objectivity. He was spitting his words. He was clearly ashamed, and he spoke about a famine of biblical proportions, and the camera goes wide and shows you this monstrous scene, and then pitilessly the camera is a cyclops eye and focuses subjectively on these elegant men and women in tattered togas, mums and dads, holding children, but with swollen heads and tiny stick bodies, like, I hope people don't take this wrong, but like they were Martians or something, like they were barely human, like we had barely allowed them to be human. And I was absolutely, as the journalist intended, appalled. And Paula, my missus beside me, didn't sob. She wasn't racked with tears, but big tears came out of her eyes, and she jumped up and ran up the stairs to see our kid. And so the report's over, and it stays with me most of the night. Bizarrely, Chris, this is wild, because we've just finished a 2-hour film on the Rats, which I was telling the lads in the band that were the world premiere is in Dublin, the Dublin Film Festival on March the 3rd. It's going out on BBC. It's a great film, even though it's about us. It's kind of interesting, though. I didn't know we were interesting. And they found a piece of film. So fast forward 2 hours after I've seen this, it's going around in my head, and I'm at some record company do or something. and the camera is on me for some reason. I'm talking to some guy, I don't recognise him, and he's saying, "This isn't bad, is it?" And I said, "It makes me sick." And he said, "What does?" And I said, "All this food and drink, you know." And I said, "Did you see that thing on TV last night, tonight?" And he said, "No." And I said, "Oh," and I just let it pass. But I didn't know that existed. So this is an hour after I've seen this. So the next morning, my Mrs. Paula, she's doing the rock and roll show at that time, which people of a certain age will remember, called The Tube, with Jules Holland. It was Paula Yates and Jules Holland. Paula had left to go to Newcastle where the show was filmed, and she'd left a note in the bowl on the kitchen table saying, "Anyone who comes to this house has to put £5 in this bowl." And I thought, that's cool, but it's not enough. The journalist had told us that 30 million people were dying of hunger. And that made me sick. To die of want in a world of surplus is not only intellectually absurd, it is economically illiterate, and it is, of course, morally repulsive. And I thought, well, the only thing I can do is write tunes, but I'm not having hits, so what's the point of that? So I called Paula in Newcastle. I said, "Who's on the show?" And she said, "Well, Midge is here beside me. Midge, you're from Ultravox, who just had a huge hit with that fantastic song, Vienna." And I said, "Put him on." And I said, "Dude, did you see that thing last night?" And he said, "No." And I said, so I told him. He said, "Well, what do you want to do?" And I said, "Listen, we're coming up to Christmas. Let's do one of those corny charity singles. Let's make 100 grand and give it to Oxfam." And he said, "Yeah, of course." He said, "What are you thinking of?" And I said, because I had no confidence now any longer in my ability, I said, let's just pick a Dylan or a Bob Marley tune, One Love, or something that, anything, let's just get on with it. And he said, "You're joking." He said, "You knock something off and I'll try something and let's go with it." And that, I mean, Midge thinks I'm nuts, but that literally, a fellow songwriter, and again, the guys behind me will understand this, just saying, that's what you do, and you're equal to me. I've just had to, get on with it, Geldof. That really got me going again. So on the way over to my mate's house, he was sick. I had a song called "It's My World," which I played to the Rats, but they didn't like it. And it was called "It's My World and There's No Need to Be Afraid." So I just said, it's Christmas time, there's no need to be afraid. What's next? Wasn't there to be afraid of? It's great here. It's fantastic. We're coming up to this time where everything is shared and we give gifts because we love people. But dude, the reality is outside the window, it's not fun at all. And so I wrote the words very quickly, and I went to my mate's place, and he had a guitar, and I just played the melody of "It's My World and There's No Need to Be Afraid." I just did that because that'll do. That afternoon, a tape came around, and I put on the tape player, and it was do 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 do, and I rang Midge. He goes, "What do you think?" And I said, "Dude, it's Z-Cars." Z-Cars is an old 60s police movie. He said, "What?" And I said, "It's Z-Cars. Do, 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 do." And he says, "Better than any you could write," which is true, But, and so I went over to his place. He had a mega studio. Midge is a fantastic producer. And I played him my thing. And I was so embarrassed playing it. I was so bad at it. And he said, "Make up your mind. What's the melody?" I said, "Okay." So I did that. He said, "Okay, leave me alone. Go away and sort out who's ever going to play on it." So we went away. And this is absolutely true. This is the sliding doors moment. The next morning, I leave my house and walk up Flood Street. We talked about the King's Road earlier, to the King's Road, where I had my coffees in a cafe called the Picasso, now long gone. But I do meetings in there as well. There used to be an antique shop there, and I passed by, and Gary Kemp, obviously the 80s, huge Spandau, is there. We know all the 80s kids because they'd come and stay the night in our place in Kent, having done the Tube, just get away. Le Bon used to literally just go to sleep on the floor with whatever girlfriend it was that weekend until Yasmin showed up. He'd just fall asleep. I'd wake him on Monday, get back to work. And I banged on the door, Kemp buying some, Art Nouveau antique piece, in his newfound wealth. And I said, "Oi," and I said, "We're doing this." He said, "Yeah, okay." I went into the Picasso. I came out, and Sting was walking up the street. And Sting had, we'd known him since we'd lived near where they were making their first album. We already had 6 hits. He could barely speak to me. His competitive spirit was still is, So he said, "Yeah, I'll do it." And Le Bon was around the same day. So at the end of the day, we had the Rats, Ultravox, Duran, Spandau, the Police. I knew I could call these new kids called U2 because they'd come and seen the Rats, you know, and stuff when we played in the clubs in Dublin. So they definitely come on board. There we were. I called up Trevor Horn. I said, you own Basing Street Studios, which is where Bob Marley did Exodus and all that. Can we have them? Yeah. So it kind of, we had the whole thing. The record company said, you know, I had to bludgeon them not to take any money. Then the publishers, we had to call them and say, no one's getting any money. And the worst came with the retailers, Woolworths, HMV, etc. I didn't want them to take any money, so I called Woolworths. And they said, well, no, it's our big selling time. We understand what you're doing, but no. And I said, that's fine, because HMV have forsworn their money, Virgin have forsworn their money, you know, etc. They said, all of them have. I said, yeah, all of them, yeah. And I said, but it's fine, like, I'm going on telly, but I will have to say not to go into your shop because the profit will go. I said, well, can we come back to you? I said, no, you can't come back to me. It's a do or die. We're up to our neck, you know. I said, okay.
No, so you
I didn't say it. I didn't say it. Then you go on and it goes monstrous. So we can't give, you know, it's the biggest selling record ever. We can't give the money to Oxfam. It's just too much. So the record company lawyer who I asked to give me 2 hours, he's still doing it. 35 years later, we're still doing it.
What's his name?
John Kennedy.
John Kennedy.
Brilliant
Hats
man.
off to you.
Yeah. So he then sets up a trust. Next minute, I'm sitting at home. I'm up to my neck in this. And the phone rings. Are you Bob Geldof? I said, yeah. He goes, it's Harry Belafonte. Harry Belafonte? Like, this is a hero. Harry Belafonte was the most beautiful black guy in America in the 50s. Hung with Marlon Brando, Frank Sinatra. He was a Marxist. He was so beautiful. He had the first national television program for a black person. He took slave songs from the Indies and put them in the number one in the Billboard chart in America, like Banana Boat song, Day-O, Day-Day, the slave songs. He took Frank Sinatra to the South to show him what happened to black musicians. Frank refused to play there anymore if his black musicians didn't play to an integrated audience and they stayed in the same hotel as him. He took Martin Luther King as a kid and travelled with him, bigged him up. Harry Belafonte is a dude, still alive, the best stories. He says, we're ashamed of, he said, we're effing ashamed of what you brick kids have done. I said, Harry, I'm Irish. Same thing. No, you know, so much for your Marxist dialectic, you know. So he says, I got Michael here. Michael, hi, Bob. You know, I said, hi, Michael. He goes, me and Lionel are writing a song with Quincy. Do you want to come over? I said, yeah, that's cool, man. So I go to America. It's USA for Africa. I walk in, Quincy Jones, are you kidding me? Paul Simon, Bruce Springsteen, Willie Nelson, Ray Charles, Bob Dylan, Smokey Robinson, Stevie Wonder, Tina Turner, and I go, Duran, Spandau Ballet. But excuse me, you know, there are gods present. And Quincy taps he's got his there's, you know, his conductor's roster, and he bangs down. Everybody, pay attention, please. And here are these giants of the culture, all standing on these bleachers, you know, like school kids at the school play. All they're paying attention to the Quincy Jones. Of course you do. He goes, okay, everybody, you all know Bob Geldof. No, nobody knows Bob Geldof, you know. So they're there, and Bob, tell them what this is all about. But you know, I mean, you'll see in the photograph of USA for Africa, for the group photo, I'm in the back row, standing beside who's the great comedian from Saturday Night Fever, Belushi, and who's the other, Aykroyd. I'm standing between them, and like my face is, I've got my head down because literally I am not worthy. What am I doing there? But at that event, that's when I thought, hold on, we put Band-Aid together with USA for Africa, which then became the biggest selling single, still is, ever in the history of the world. So we put them together, and I spoke to Bruce, who I'm still friendly with. In fact, I knew him from '78, the Rats did, because he was trying to get going then as well. And I said, you know, are you up for doing something? He said, if I'm not doing anything, yeah, come back to me, you know. And I said, no, seriously. I said, I might do this. And in the film of USA for Africa, you'll see me saying, I may be back to all you people. So that was where I thought, let's join these up. So that was where the idea of Live Aid really had its genesis. As this thing sort of took on a life of its own, it needed to come to a head where the world was addressed, as we started this whole conversation earlier this morning, with rock and roll, which had now become the global culture, the transmitter of ideas, the thing that opened up people trapped in the sort of aspic of the Cold War, trapped behind the Iron Curtain. You know, we could talk to them in the lingua franca of the planet, which was no longer English, but was pop music. And that was how we translate this idea. Do you agree that the death of 30 million people would be a body blow to the human corpus? That would be hard for us all, knowing that it was occurring, knowing we could stop it as Europe produced surplus grain, America produced surplus grain, knowing we could stop this in a continent 8 miles from Europe, the richest continent separated by 8 miles from the poorest, where 30 million people are in agony. It's agony to die of hunger. You actually don't die of lack of food, you die because your system collapses. And at that point, your muscles can't scream. So all those children were just opening their mouths to scream. You'll see it on the BBC News film. They're opening their mouths to scream, and nothing comes out except at that, and it's agony. So we're doing Live Aid, and David Bowie, who could not do enough, he's the nicest man, God bless him. He wasn't the cold, aesthetic, thin white duke. He was a dude. He was lovely guy, and was since even the beginning of the Rats, when I hitchhiked to Europe to try and get gigs out of Dublin, and I went to see the Black and White Thin White Duke tour, one of the best gigs I've ever seen. And I blagged backstage. I was just sitting in his dressing room, and he just looked over. He says, "Who are you?" I said, "Oh, I'm a singer in a band." He goes, "What band is it?" And we just chatted to this doofus sitting in the corner. And I got him to sign a Rats demo tape. He said, "Is that one of mine?" I said, "No, it's one of mine." He goes, "You cheeky sod." So I call him, and he wears these appalling Feed the World t-shirts. "What do you want me to do?" So we're sitting late at night. I say, "Before we start, David, I want to show you this film." And the CBC, Canadian Broadcasting journalist, could not show what he'd shot because it was just too much, and he edited in the Addis Ababa Hilton, the bits, he stringing it together just for the record, and he was listening to the Cars' Who's Going to Drive You Home on his headphones as he cut it. And when he'd finished, he'd realised that this pop song, just like Codeline's songs we've been listening, take on a whole different thing. It's to the point of the essay you asked me to read. Who's gonna pick you up when you fall down? Who's gonna drive you home tonight? And in the context of what he'd cut. So David was watching this with Harvey Goldsmith, the great promoter, and me, and the agony of these children. And he just collapsed. This is the empirical, distant, cold, Thin White Duke. Collapsed in tears and could not recover. And he said, "What do you want me to do again?" And I said, "David Bowie, 4 songs. You know, everyone's got 15 minutes. You've got 20, David, you know." And he said, "I'm cutting it. I want to show this." And I said, "David, please, once you cut it, people go and make a cup of tea. We've lost them. They're not coming back." And he said, I'll do 3 songs. I want to introduce this. I said, "You're going to do Heroes? I'll do Heroes before this." So if you watch it, the Queen movie has it that the lines collapsed when Queen played. Queen were superb. But everyone watch it, reached above themselves for some reason. You talk about sliding doors. Just, they are the best performances by those bands ever. Ever. McCartney hadn't played for 6 years, nervous, cramping. The piano doesn't work. So out comes Bowie, me, and Pete Townsend to help him through it, and the crowd just sing "Let It Be." I mean, and he was just glowing. You know, it just kicked off.
It was divine help.
Yeah.
Divine on backing vocals.
Bowie does Heroes. The crowd are heroes. Like, it cuts to Philadelphia. There's millions in Philadelphia singing Heroes. And he just says, thank you. I want you to pay attention to this. And he just leaves the stage. And it's the most beautiful day. And here's beautiful youth. These beautiful boys. And on their shoulders, these beautiful flowers. These girls. In the prime of their youth, they're just in the day. They're just glowing. And you feel that everywhere. Vladivostok, Tierra del Fuego, they're all glowing in the day. And out comes this film by this CBC journalist. Who's gonna pick you up? And you watch, particularly there's a shot, I remember the girl, and she's going, yeah, rock and roll, who's gonna pick? And she suddenly realises, and she wilts. And she tries to get off her boyfriend's shoulder. He doesn't know what's going on. He's watching the screen and there's just horror on their faces. And it changes. Bang. Literally, quite literally, because there were only phone lines, the phone lines around the world go down. People trying to call in. They go down and everyone scrambles. I'm backstage going, what's going on? What are you doing? But that's what happened.
Amazing. So thank goodness Dave wasn't a hit, is the thing, isn't it? I suppose.
Well,
poor Dave.
Like I say in the book, when of course, America wouldn't let me call it Dave because I was writing a love song to one of the guys in the band whose girlfriend had died of a heroin overdose at the end of our tour, and he called me at night, and I had nothing to say. But the next morning, I wrote Dave, which is just a word of love to a mate. And the Americans said, we can't have a man singing a love song to another man. So change the words. I said, to what? Anything. I said, okay, rain. I said, rain will do. So I said, it's okay, do it. But it still wasn't a hit.
The Chris Evans Breakfast Show with Sky.